Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's Society of Decision Professionals Learning Exchange. My name is Hilda Churekjian, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's presentation titled Experimenting with Values. I would like now to introduce you to the speakers you will be hearing from today. Our featured speaker for today is Somik Raha. Somik Raha holds a PhD in decision analysis from Stanford University with a dissertation titled Achieving Clarity on Value. He currently works as a product manager and associate at SmartOrg. He has been the chair of the SCP Portal Council since its inception. Somik, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Thank you, Hilda.
Our moderator for today's presentation is Karen Jenny. Karen is a professional decision analyst with over 20 years of consulting experience. She is a principal at Decision Insight and an SCP board member. Karen holds a PhD in engineering and a public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. Karen, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Thank you, Hilda.
Karen will facilitate your questions throughout the presentation and raise them to our speaker to address live during and at the end of the webinar. And now, without any further delay, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to our featured speaker, Somik Raha. Somik, you have the floor.
Right. Morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be addressing this audience. And thank you to Karen for helping me with this. So at any time, if you have a question, a quick reminder, I welcome any clarifying questions throughout the talk. So just put it in the Q&A box, and Karen will stop me and ask. If you have any philosophical questions, I request that you hold it for a little later when we have an open Q&A. So with that, let me begin with a poll. So when you hear the term values, what are you primarily hearing? And I'd like you to pick the one that applies the most. So we often hear values as measures. This is value functions, utility functions, things like that. Then there's value-focused thinking, which is about distinguishing between means and ends. And then there's values as norms, which is really about cultural norms that are prevalent in society and in organizations. So I'd like to request Hilda to open the poll. So what are you hearing when you hear the term values? We'll give it 10 seconds more. It looks like we have most of the votes. Oh, people are still voting. Let's give it a few more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. Thank you, Hilda. So this is very interesting. So not surprising that most of our audience hears of values as measures. And then the second is value-focused thinking, and the third is values as norms. So this is not a talk about any of these three listenings on values. This is about a fourth kind of listening that I'll be talking about today, which is completely separate from these other three uses of that term. And I'm going to focus on values as meta strategy. Basically, the one-line takeaway from everything I'm going to say after this is that your values are your highest level strategy. So let's start by looking at what brushing our teeth can teach us about values. So most people generally brush twice a day. And if you think about this, the count of how many times we've brushed is actually very useful, because if I have not brushed at night, I have a checkbox of like, wait a second, I have committed to brushing twice a day and I have not met that commitment, so I better do it. So the count helps me take action and do it. But the number of times I've brushed is not equal to dental hygiene, which is what I'm really after. And dental hygiene is important to me because my personal well-being is important. And so these are three different dimensions of value. And the first one, the counting, is systemic value. How many times I've brushed is just a system I've created which helps me get to the practical value of dental hygiene. And the practical value of dental hygiene is important because my intrinsic value of personal well-being is important. And the idea of intrinsic values, it's that final thing which you cannot justify. This is the end in itself. So these are three different dimensions of value. And the key thing here that I would like you to reflect on is anything in life that you've ever counted is really a system. We're defining systemic value as a construct. Anything artificial, any metric, any ideology, any rule fulfillment is systemic value. Anything you've actually counted does not really count. It's not what you're really after. And whatever you've really been after cannot actually be counted. Dental hygiene, if you think about it, you can't really count it. You have these proxies of how many cavities somebody has, but there is really no way to measure dental hygiene. So this is a very big point that I'm trying to make here. So could you take a moment to reflect on this and share examples from your life that illustrate this? Any examples, any stories from your life, and we'll pause for a minute or two to collect your reflections. And if you resonate with this, you can also share that. And if you have a counterexample where you think this doesn't hold, you're also welcome to share that. So we'll just give it a few minutes. So I see one question from Keith, and he asks, why can't you count functioning teeth? Sure, you can count functioning teeth, but that is, again, not equal to dental hygiene. That's a good metric. That tells you a lot about dental hygiene, but not equal to dental hygiene. In fact, you can't properly define dental hygiene. You can talk about it, you can talk about different attributes of it, but you really can't measure it. What you're measuring is functioning teeth, and you'll have to pass the clarity test on it. But the moment you do that, that's a systemic value. The reason you're doing it is because you're interested in dental hygiene. That's a good question, Keith. Somebody else says, maybe you can count what really counts eventually, but not in a relevant timeline. Well, I think it's more fundamental than that, because you can try making as many measures as you want, but those measures are basically artificial constructs of a reality that you're experiencing. So the moment you make a construct, you have shifted away from experience. And I'll share more about that in a moment. Here is one. Somebody says, the quality of my relationship with family members. That's a wonderful example. You could count things like how much time do I spend with my family, and use that to drive commitment to action, which is making sure that you do spend time. But that the time you spend is not equal to the quality of your relationship. It's a very, very interesting and fundamental distinction. Thank you. That's a wonderful example. I see one from Arn, counting number of countries visited. Difficult to count diversity, cultural learning of travel. That's, again, a wonderful example. Thank you, Arn. Maybe somebody says that you can count quality of relationship with family at your funeral. Yes, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be around to count. That's funny. Yes, Yes, it's kind of interesting. A dear friend recently passed away, and this person spent a lot of time serving the community by posting thoughtful comments on a community website on thoughtful reflections. And there's been an outpouring of support from people who never knew this guy and just saying how much they were touched by it. Now, the count of how many people shared is maybe an indication of the impact he had, but it is not equal to the impact he had, and that's another good example. Price is a measure of customer value that can discriminate a product but is not value in itself. Wonderful, wonderful example. Price is a fantastic proxy, so is profit. It tells you whether you're actually doing something useful, but it is not equal to the value being created. Meaningfulness of my life, that's a great example of intrinsic value. It's something that you can't even begin to talk about. So that I'll draw another distinction there. If you can talk about it, in some sense, in a practical sense, it's a practical value, instrumental value. If you can't begin to talk about it, but it is super, super important, that's probably an intrinsic value. And if you can easily measure it, then that's a systemic value. These are all wonderful examples. Thank you so much. This is very helpful. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I was going to talk more about the distinction between experience and the labels we give to those experiences. So the great poets of the world already know about this, and they in different traditions, they talk about this. And here's one poem. Now this is, in an alternate reality, I would actually present this to you in its full lyrical beauty, it's actually musical. But since I'm musically challenged, I'll just read the poem, the translation out. And it says, "The one who confuses the label water for water is naive indeed. Repeating water, water, such a one is destined to die of thirst." And then the opposite example is also given. "Repeating fire, fire produces not a scratch on the lip. An ember on your lip will immediately burn it." I find this poem very powerful in communicating in a pithy way this idea that whatever we're talking about is not the experience, but it's an indication. It can point you towards it, but that's a fundamental difference. And so I also want to make sure that I'm not criticizing the wrong thing here. So this poet, this is something which no one should ever do, which is unpack a poem, but I'll plead guilty to this. I feel that the poet is not criticizing the use of labels. He is criticizing the conflation of the label with the experience. That's another fundamental distinction. Labels are super helpful, but they're not the experience. So I want to focus this talk more on intrinsic values, and to me, they're really about finding your deepest values. You're going to what you really stand for. But how would you know that you are talking about intrinsic values? So I have found some signs that you're getting close. And what I find is when people are shaking, they get emotional, they weep, or they go silent. I find that to be a great signal that they are touching something very, very, very fundamental. And another poet, Tagore, has this wonderful phrase. He says, "The small truth has words that are clear. The great truth has great silence." So anytime we can access that great silence in our hearts, I think we are coming very, very close to our intrinsic values. That's the kind of stuff that I want to explore. So let's keep going. So a test. So when I often talk to people will come up with all sorts of interesting values. And the test I often use is, are most people likely to say "me too" for that particular value? And if yes, then perhaps we should keep looking. Because the kind of values I'm looking for, what I've found is people tend to have these unique values that only they care about in such an odd way, in such an intense way. And I'm not saying that this is the case for everyone, but if I start with the assumption that this is so, and I probe, I end up finding it. And it has some very, very interesting properties, which I will talk about in a moment. But this is the test I often use, that are your values, oftentimes people will say integrity. Well, integrity is so fundamentally important that everyone should value integrity. It shouldn't be unique to any individual. but there is something that stirs you and you alone in a very, very particular way. That's the kind of stuff that would be very interesting to uncover. Again, let's take the help of the poets to emphasize the spirit of this idea. And this is Tagore's poem. He says, "Under the sky, studded with the sun and myriad stars, in a universe throbbing with life, I have received my little space. In sheer wonder, music springs from the depths of my soul." It's that music that I'm trying to find. It's that, and it's unique to every individual person. So the question really is, what is that music that you were born to play? So let's illustrate this with a little story, and let's get back to the world of decision consulting. So, as you know, I work for SmartOrg, and which is a dream environment for me. And this was my one of my first projects here. That we were doing a decision consulting workshop, and our remit was help us double our revenues from $500 million to $1 billion. And we pretty much got a green field, which is just, we could try any trick in the book to help them brainstorm to find ways of doing this. And what happened was we basically got stuck. We kept trying all of the strategy ideas that we've learned from different books, from our own experience, everything, every exercise, and we just kept getting stuck. And what we found was the people in this organization were not inspired by any of these ideas. They just could not envision, they could not connect to this goal of doubling their revenue. They just couldn't. So, and I was a junior consultant, so I was following my boss, David, and David, I told David, I don't think this is really a strategy exercise, a strategy workshop. I think this is more of a values question. The question is, who do these guys want to be? And perhaps we need to get them to reflect on what they stand for. So David says, oh yeah, this is, I understand what you're saying, but I've never sold values workshops before. Maybe you can try. And I have never sold values workshops either. So I don't know what to do. So I went to the president of the company and I said, sir, I think you guys need to get clear on your values, and that might help. And the first thing he said was, oh, values. Yeah, I have a big poster in the office, and it says integrity. I said, well, that's wonderful. Integrity is really important, but that's not what I'm talking about. So I tried, but I kind of failed to communicate what I meant. So I gave up. And then we were doing this strategy table exercise. We had mapped out the different strategy alternatives, and they were quite different. And we were asking the audience to envision each of those paths and work them out. And we, again, got stuck. And this time, they just could not come up with any meaningful action or any meaningful connection. So at that point, David kind of asked, well, what's going on here? And somebody in middle management said, in a very shaky voice, she said, and this is, by the way, a plastic packaging company. So she said, I work in a plastic packaging company, but I'm the person who drives the Prius, and I stitch my own bags when I go to the market. I actually basically hate plastic, and I want to do some meaningful work. I want us to change the world. I want us to find ways of taking it to a better place. I don't want to be part of a problem. And when she said all this, there was pin drop silence. No one spoke for a while. And then the president of the company, who was also there, he spoke up. And very softly he said, me too. And that gave us a huge opening. We said, okay, you know what? We need a values exercise here. So we organized a little workshop where we asked them, what transformation do you want to have in the world with your career in this company? And we had people interview each other, and we said, well, it's not just about the first thing that comes to your mind, but we want to use these distinctions that, the ones I shared with you earlier about intrinsic values. I want to find the point at which people get emotional, they get silent, they shake, all of those signs. Until they come to that point, I want to keep digging. So we had people interview each other, and they came up with something that completely blew my mind. So they came up with 4 values. The first was safe. The safe in the sense that their packaging makes food safe for people to consume. It is of such high quality that you can trust the food that you're eating. And they believe safety is a fundamentally important value for them, and it's a just because. Second is natural. Because of their packaging, people don't need to add preservatives. So they don't need to put preservatives in their food. They have aseptic packaging technology. So natural is a fundamental value. It's an intrinsic value for them. They believe people have a right to natural food. The third is economic, that because of their packaging, you can take food over long distances without spoilage, and people can afford things that they couldn't afford earlier. So they are helping people in their quality of life, and that's, again, a just because for them. And the fourth one was sustainable. Because of their packaging, people could now, grow. You don't have to grow as much food on the planet because you can preserve the food better. So the strain on the planet is a lot less. And all four of these things, it's made possible primarily because of packaging. And that is a fundamental shift. Packaging is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. But the end is basically these four things that you'll see in the next slide. Now, in an initial iteration, we called it safe, natural, productive, and easy. And it was so fundamental. It was such a big shift that it changed the culture of the organization. In fact, what you're seeing here is it's a core slide of the three things that went to the board. This was one of them. And so the board of this company sees this, and they're like, hell yeah, we are completely behind this. This is a fantastic thing, and it's great. It gives us so much clarity. So the board enthusiastically supported this. And I'm showing this slide because you can see that there are other things on it. It's not just about the meta strategy, but it's also about all these other things, like being a formidable competitor, being a business we're proud of. So it's also about the journey that they're on. But my focus is primarily on what I'm calling the meta strategy. It's the purpose of the organization. It's why they exist, and it's behind every other strategy they can possibly make. So this was very exciting for me to see this, that it was having a transformation in their culture. Before in cocktail parties, people would ask, what do you guys do? And they would hesitate and say, oh, we make plastic. And now they're saying, oh, we stand for safe, natural, productive, easy, all these very inspiring values, and this is how we make it possible. So this was great. But then they had an M&A head, merger and acquisition head, who was very experienced, very good at it. And he found that this meta strategy was extremely powerful in checking for strategic fit. So he basically made the rule that if any opportunity was to be evaluated, they had to demonstrate that it was a great fit with these four ideas, and that opportunity had to make a quantum leap in these four traits. They called it traits. And only if they had the fit, they would look at the numbers and do the decision analysis, which was pretty phenomenal. Like, we didn't expect. This is something which was very surprising for us. So, and he had this quote. He said, I've never seen a soft tool work this well in the hard-nosed job of numbers, and mergers and acquisitions are about a lot of modeling and numbers and so on, and also integration. A lot of challenges there. But this is like the fundamental, the first step. The values is the highest end, the beginning point, and everything else is downstream of your values. And basically, my conclusion from all of this is that the strategy project went really well. They found lots of wonderful ideas to double their revenue. My conclusion is, though, that when you ask anybody to deliver on things like doubling market share or your revenues, the human mind is such that it just shuts down. We're unable to process something so intangible. And it's kind of funny, we use the word tangible and intangible. If you really think about it, you can't actually feel numbers. But you can feel your values because you're emotional about them. So when we ask people, how do you deliver on your values, they have lots of good ideas. And in fact, what happened was one of their global heads, this guy was in Australia, he was a finance manager. He called me one day and he said, this is all wonderful stuff, but I'm going to India, and our Indian operation has, it's a loss-making operation, and these guys, they, I don't know what to do. You have lots of material. You have like 130 slides. What do I take, and how can I help them? So I said, well, if you really wanted to take just two ideas, one would be the values piece, which is ask them, how can they deliver on safe, natural, economic, and sustainable in the context of India with your technology? And the ideas that come up use the tornado diagrams, to find the swing on how big is the opportunity, size the opportunity with the decision analysis tools. Those are the only two things I would put in there and keep it simple. Then he comes back and he says, oh, our portfolio went up from $2 million to $30 million. And I asked, what do you do? And he said, I tried the values exercise. And then, of course, he used our tools to put the quantitative numbers. So this was like a huge confirmation for us that, the idea of using values for ideation is extremely powerful, that it just unleashes something very generative in people. Because it's their values. It's not us lecturing anyone. It's coming from within. So values are not something you internalize. Values are something you externalize because it's already inside of you and you want to share it with the rest of the world. So now I'm going to switch tracks a little bit. So we saw that this works so well in this company, but what about us at SmartOrg? So we tried this exercise initially. We said, well, what are SmartOrg's values? And we started by mapping it out. And there's a lot of wonderful things on the slide, but basically it came down to having fun making organizations smarter. And there's a whole book called The Smart Organization on which, from which the name of our company comes. And so when we made this, my first reaction was, and I was telling David, that this actually doesn't inspire me very much, this idea of having fun making organizations smarter. This is okay, this is cool, but this is actually not good enough for me to show up to work. There's a lot of problem on our planet with smartness. I would rather be supporting wisdom. And all of these other things, they are the universal values. If you really think about it, every company should have some version of this. So this is not our meta strategy. This is excellent for how we want to live, how the home we want to build here. That's great, but it's not a meta strategy. So I took a crack at this, and this is what I came up with. So this comes, by the way, as context, this comes after lots of mappings of different individuals and CEOs and executives and so on. And I found that the intrinsic values can be mapped into three categories, and I call them the head, the heart, and the habit. And your head is basically the professional field you find yourself in. This is where you raise your hand saying, yes, I'm a part of this profession. This is where your skills are involved. And your heart is a goal that's truly inspiring to you. This is something which is not easy to achieve. It will take a lot of blood, mostly yours. And the habit is something which is not a decision you make. It's something which has always been around, as in you show up and this shows up with you. In fact, it's your biggest blessing and your biggest curse. You can't turn it off. So with these three categories, my mapping of SmartOrg is that we are in the business of finance business partnering. We help finance organizations within a company or an organization help the rest of the organization be successful. And this is by bringing in the tools of forecasting, the tools of quantitative decision analysis in having high-quality conversations. But where heart lies is really in restoring dignity to economic evaluations. And if you think about it, this idea of dignity is so fundamental because people generally roll their eyes when they hear of economics. They're like, oh, somebody asked me for a forecast, somebody asked me for an estimate. And I know this is BS because I don't know the future, so I'm being asked to lie. A lot of people have that kind of reaction. And we go in by telling them, no, with the language of uncertainty, you can tell the whole truth. And suddenly people find dignity in their work of forecasting. They're not stuck anymore with doing things they don't believe in. And it's a very empowering idea. And that gets me to show up to work. But our habit is building agile decision systems. So whatever you do, SmartOrg ultimately will bring it down to software. That's just a part of our DNA. So that can be a curse if you don't manage it wisely. So we're getting very good at saying no to places where you will not be better served with systems, but where you need systems is where we really shine. So the combination of these three things are really about SmartOrg. This is what we stand for. So in general, if things that have worked for me in finding your purpose is that you can be a friend to someone. You can look for silence and emotion. You can test the values. Try each of these ideas, the head, heart, and the habit, and see if any one of these is missing. And ask the person, is something big going to be missing in your life if one of these three things is missing? And look for uniqueness, not universality. Should I stop for a question, Karen? I see a question here.
Yeah, I think there's a question that fits nicely right here. The question was, doesn't it take a special group of people to have a values conversation like that? Seems like a rare thing, though it's beautiful when it happens.
It's a great question. I don't really know the answer, but I'm finding I'm actually experimenting. So I find that I make a lot of assumptions on what's okay and what's not okay in the workplace. And I've been very moved by Tina Seelig. Tina Seelig is a professor of creativity and innovation at Stanford, and she wrote this book, What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20. And she says in that book that when you get a job, it's not really a job. It's the keys to the office. Think of it that way. So you're actually getting permission to create whatever mayhem you want. And if you choose to have these kinds of conversations, the only person really stopping you is you yourself. So I found that to be a very empowering way of thinking. And every time I've tried having these conversations at SmartOrg, I've received great support. Now that said, I can easily believe that there are environments where people won't appreciate this, but you never know. I mean, you'd rather find out by asking and know that they won't support it than be your own enemy and stop yourself from asking. Those are some thoughts that come up for me. Here's a little story. So I met a couple once, and the husband, and they were actually going to get married soon. And so the husband was in the hotel business, so his family was in there. And his fiancée was going to join him, and they were thinking of doing something together. We said, okay, let's try mapping your values and see where it goes. And so his head was in hospitality. His heart was in creating very warm, welcoming spaces. And his habit was around celebration. So this is a guy who would celebrate every family event in the grandest way possible. And he just would go to the minutest detail, trying to make things special. So this was John's, his values around his hotel business. But when I mapped his fiance's values, she was in the M&A space. She had an MBA. She was doing mergers and acquisitions. But her heart seemed to be in healing people the deepest way possible. And she, in the sense, almost, she sounded like a therapist almost. And she had this very interesting quality of detachment. It is very odd that for most people, if you hear somebody's traumatic story, it traumatizes us. But for her, she could hear really intense stuff and not be affected by it. She could keep her balance. And this is not something she could turn off. This is just who she was. So we said, well, wait a second. Maybe your field is not hotel management or in the M&A space. Perhaps it's in becoming a therapist. And she's like, well, it's been a big dream for me to be in this space of being a therapist. And I've never really taken steps in this direction. So now, before the conversation, it was about how can she support her fiancé in the hotel business. And after, it was about transitioning to becoming a therapist. And the idea was, well, of course she can help her husband in the hotel business. He can help her in becoming a better therapist. But their paths are quite different. And it's in celebrating that diversity. You don't want to turn people into uniform beings. There are no uniform distributions here. It's about uniqueness. Another one was the CEO asked around, they were redesigning their website, and it was around, well, what should we put? What is the marketing message? And so, well, let's try mapping your values. And so this guy, Doug, he runs a retrofit company, and his head was around energy efficiency. That's the business they're in. So they will come in and they'll say, oh, you have inefficient devices in your organization. We'll replace them for you. And you'll save money on your bill, in your utilities bill. But his heart was really around building ecosystem solutions. So his point was, people complain a lot, oh, we have too many carbon emissions and we can't do anything to save the planet. But he wanted to help regular people go the last mile. And he said, look, people don't know how to reduce their carbon footprint. We know. So we will help them. We will do the analysis, and we will even come and change their devices. And what's more, we will even go to the utilities and get a reimbursement. So the utilities give financial support, saying, we'll give you a voucher of some sort, and if you can reduce their bill by this amount. So they will get that voucher, and they will finance the business to be able to make these retrofits happen. So imagine how much they've thought about this problem. They're about building these ecosystems where people can go towards cleaner energy. But the habit was around visionary change. He wasn't interested in incremental. He wanted to really disrupt the ecosystem. This is just who he was, and this is what he wanted his company to be. And so once we got this, it became pretty clear that this is what they wanted to externalize to the world. So that's another quick example. And in concluding remarks, when I shared this framework at DAG, Kentaro Nakamichi from Deloitte, he came over, and he is from Japan, and he had a very nice, reading on this, and he said, well, it sounds like these three Japanese words, Shingi Tai, the Chinese characters, so I think Chinese people can also read this. But the way he heard this was the heart was really about what you truly value. The head is about your skills, and the habit is about the structure in which you're going to deliver this. And I wanted to emphasize that, frameworks are plenty. Like, we can come up with any framework we want, but this is really getting to the essence of what I'm trying to communicate. So, in summary, values as meta strategies upstream of all practical considerations. This is about the mountain you want to climb, which is quite distinct from how you want to walk on the road. That's also important, but this is a separate, I'm focusing on a very specific piece here. And it's the highest given in a decision. So when you look at the decision hierarchy, which I find extremely useful, this is about the commitment to strategic fit. Example, in the packaging company, the safe, natural, etc. You're declaring that we commit to using this as a strategic fit. And I might just add that if you're doing any DA value calculations, they're all systemic values. They're basically not the intrinsic value. So this is just a conclusion of if you followed the line of thinking so far. But I also want to make another important point, which is systematizing to get to the value is essential, but it's not the value. Now, systems drive action. So, I may be sounding negative on systems, but I really am not. And so this is a quick example on the Stanford Police Department. So I worked with them for a couple of years, actually, and after hanging out with them for a long time, this is my current thinking on where their head, heart, and habit lies. The head is in public safety. Their heart is in education, in educating people to be better citizens, to be safe, to obey the law, and so on. But their habit is on this really weird idea of dignity of the client. And by client, they mean people they can sometimes arrest. So even when they're arresting offenders, those offenders are their clients, and they will maintain the dignity of those people. Now, this is a very, very powerful, breathtaking value, and this is a part of their habit. So these three things are wonderful, but it took a lot of work to create an organization that delivers on this. And one of the ways in which they did it was to make a rule that we're going to hire highly educated people who resonate with this idea of dignity of clients. And so they had the old guard, which didn't buy into that value. They just said, no, you're talking about bums on the street. I don't think they're any kind of client of ours, and they have no dignity. We want to put them in jail. And so the police chief, Marvin Harrington, who was at the time who was formulating this, he said, well, I'm going to wait for these guys to retire. When I hire new people, I'm only going to hire them based on whether they have this fit with this value. And as a result, now that department is amazing. I mean, they have people who believe and buy into these values. So he had to actually create a rule, a very systemic rule, in order to make this value come to life. Now, just by doing this, it won't guarantee it, but without doing this, the values are just entertainment. If you don't systematize it, they won't come to your life. So systems drive action. The criteria for fit is just one example of a system. It's not the value, but it can get us to the values. Now, making multi-attribute models to trade off these values kind of misses the point if, one of the questions that often comes up. And a great example, I got this at DAG, actually, from an oil and gas company.
Somik, if I could just step in for a second, you're at about the time you wanted to be at decision quality. So I think maybe you have to skip the oil and gas story.
Okay, this is actually the last ending point, so I'll get to it in a few seconds.
Okay.
So this story was that they were doing this analysis of a particular fuel, and in this fuel, the attribute it delivered on was clean and safe, and whatever this technology was. And it compared to another technology which was not as clean and safe, but it was much cheaper. So the better technology was much more expensive. And so this analyst went to his boss and said, well, what should we do? Should we do a full multi-attribute analysis on this? And he said, are you kidding? If you can really deliver on clean and safe in such a big leap, that's what we stand for. That's what this company, that's why we are around. I don't need a multi-attribute analysis for this. Of course we're doing it, and over time this will get cheaper, but this is why we exist. And that is a fantastic example of why these intrinsic values have such a moving power over us. But analysis is good when we're confused, and I'll skip this story in the interest of time. If there is time, you can ask me in Q&A, and I have this interesting story where analysis did help people understand their intrinsic values a lot better. This is the Amazon rainforest. I'll tell you later if there's time. But I want to get to what Karen mentioned, which is how does this affect decision quality? And so if you look at the 6 elements of decision quality, which has really, really been helpful to me in my life, when I look at the words we use to describe it, I find that most of them are head-oriented words. And that's fine, but most people, most decision analysts that I've learned from, they actually bring a lot of heart to their game. So I find that we are actually short-selling ourselves by only focusing or articulating the head when they bring it out in their lives, this heart element. And so each element, in the frame, it's not just about appropriate frame, it's about the meaningful frame. So I mentioned the plastic packaging story. It's about how are you going to deliver on your values. It's not so much about how do you become a $1 billion business, although that's a good side effect. It will follow. The alternatives that you have should be inspiring and not just feasible. And there again, the plastic packaging story talks about, how whatever idea people come up with has to deliver a quantum leap on the values they have. And by the way, I'm interpreting all of these from the context of meta strategy. So you can of course interpret them from other aspects as well, but I'm taking that particular lens for now. Information should be decisive, and that's the reason I wanted to touch on the oil and gas story, that even though you have 2 attributes and you have maybe a couple others, this was so powerful that you didn't need any other information. If you truly believe that it's going to be a quantum leap, the executive said, we're just going to do it. That's the decisive nature of information. And values, the whole talk was about values, and here I draw a distinction between preferences, trade-offs, and metrics, which is the head talking, and the heart talking is what's your noble purpose. And then the 4th element of decision quality used to be called logic, and I've changed that. I'm proposing integration, where logic is the head aspect of it, clear logic, and the heart aspect is a community narrative. And I have a little story here. So the Hazelden Foundation, this is an organization that helps individuals and families cope with alcohol abuse or substance abuse. So people, when they're really down and out with these kinds of problems, they come to the Hazelden Foundation to kick their habits and get some help. And so they were looking at capital investment projects, and their analysis basically said that they wanted to spend a lot of money improving their facilities. And this caused a huge backlash because their employees were asking, well, if you have these extra funds, why don't you just give us raises? And what they did was very interesting. They basically connected their analysis to their values, their meta strategy. And they said, look, we want to redesign our spaces to be welcoming and comfortable. So they were talking about making the chairs very, very soft and not sharp edges, so that when people sit, they can really comfortably cozy in and feel at home. And their explanation was that when people come to them, they've taken a severe beating on their ego, on life in general. They're really battered. And at that point, they need to feel safe to open up and receive help. So their patients have dignity, and this is their way of honoring that dignity to make that happen. So when they gave this explanation, the people of that organization felt really moved, and they said, okay, we support this. Let's do it. And when they did it in one facility, people saw the difference it made to their clients, and the other facility lined up saying, hey, we want these improvements in our facilities too. So this is a very powerful example, and I'm sure you had stories in your life where you've seen the opposite, where opposite happen in the news, where you'll see these labor negotiations getting stuck, where it's an us versus them game. So I want to take a little pause here and ask people, have you found a time in your life where you've had to share a narrative connecting your insight to values, and you found that the numbers were not enough to share your insights or have it be accepted? So we'll pause for a minute or two here and see what stories come up for you, what reflections come up. And if it just resonates, or if you want to ask a question around this or the other 4 elements, feel free to do so as well. And I know there are lots of people here who have tons of experience, so I'm sure there are some good stories in this group. And while people are typing in their stories, if they are, Karen, if you had any questions for me, you could put them in this point as well.
I guess while we're seeing if other people have stories, I guess I'd ask Somik, I'm going to turn the question around back on you. Do you have any stories yourself about where you didn't need the narrative, where the numbers are enough? I guess from my perspective, I find for personal decisions, you always need the narrative, but you don't always need them with kind of business decisions. And I'm wondering if you've had both experiences.
That's a fascinating question. You're making me reflect on this. I feel that almost every time I've done anything with numbers and I've just stuck with the numbers, I've lost people. And only when I've connected to a story that is meaningful to them, which is, what do they care about, their deepest values, only then the numbers have connected. Oh, here we have one story. It happens with public investments where the money spent is high, but it is possible to calculate benefits for people. Oh, I just missed it. Happens with public investments where the money spent is high, but it is possible to calculate benefits for people like life quality, more education, less cars in the streets. Yeah, I believe there is and should always be a narrative underpinning any number. Wonderful. Predicting competitor moves cannot be simplified by metrics because decision-maker biases and preferences influence the answer. Yeah, there's a story in there. Yes, absolutely. There's another one. GSK decided to manufacture vaccines in third world countries to rebuild their reputation after a black eye from HIV drug pricing in South Africa, even though the economics were slightly negative. It's another wonderful story there. The people really are motivated to do good for the world, and I find that our business language is kind of upside down, and we make too many assumptions around what a business stands for. I'll have more to say on that a little later. These are great. So here's another one. I work in projects and I have specific metrics to report. Sometimes they look off, example, behind schedule, but they don't explain why. So I have to add a comment to complement the metrics. Yeah, this is not even so esoteric. It's as simple as the numbers are so our brain goes kind of all jello on us when we see too many numbers and we can't really figure out what's going on. And a story is what helps make it come alive. So very good. And keep the stories coming, and so other people can also read it while we're going on. So I'd like to go to the last element of decision quality. Commitment to action, and I feel like the head part of it is on action plans, and I'd even add high-quality commitments, the idea of making quality requests of people and so on. So that's all, very powerful head stuff, and the hard stuff for me is leadership, followership, and what I'd like to call laddership. Let's talk about this for a little bit. So leadership. And I'm again taking a very narrow focus on meta strategy, and you can unpack this in all kinds of dimensions. So for me, Steve Jobs is a wonderful example. And he was pretty much the guardian of Apple's core value of beautiful design. And he used to have this phrase, for those who've read his interviews or his biography, of making insanely great products. And that's something he just felt like he was a guardian, like he just had to do it. So what would be my version of Apple's meta strategy? And this is, of course, completely my version. I'll take my liberties on this. But if I had to put it down, I would say that their head is around think different. Their heart is around insanely great products, and their habit is Zen minimalism. Now, the head, there's a whole video here, so when you get the slides, you can click on this. It's a wonderful YouTube video on Steve Jobs explaining how their marketing is about values, and the value they stand for is to help people think differently. So Apple makes products for those who like to think different. So that's where they stake their claim. They understand those people very well intellectually. Heart is around making fantastic products, but the habit that they really, really emphasize is minimalism, and Apple is famous for this. Now, there are lots of things in Steve Jobs' life that are not to be emulated, not admirable, but I feel like this is one of those things which is extremely admirable. The followership aspect is, I feel, it doesn't get its space in our culture because we emphasize too much the leader. But I find that the first follower, the second follower, third, seventh, or even the 700th follower are just as important, and we don't recognize them as much. So an example is Gandhi. So Gandhi is very famous. He stood for many important things in life, and very few people actually know of his successor, Vinoba. And Vinoba is a very, very interesting person in our history because Gandhi chose him as a spiritual successor. And Vinoba did a fantastic thing. So this was just after India got independence. There was a lot of rioting, and the Indian subcontinent was racked with the ideas of communism. And basically they wanted to follow China as example, and the communists were using violence to kill landowners to redistribute land in a very violent fashion. And so Vinoba took this journey to another part of the country where they spoke a completely different language. So he didn't even know their native language. And he then met everybody, including the communists who were in jail. He met them, and I don't know how he did it, but in 2 hours he convinced them that communism wasn't the way to go, and they had to give peace a chance. And then he talked to the villagers and said, well, what will get you to stop your agitation? Well, how much land do you guys really need? And they said, we just need 2 acres each. And then there were like 40 families. And then one of the landowners said, if that's all you need, I would like to gift it to you. And that launched a very big movement in Vinoba's mind, which is called Bhudan, or land donation, voluntary land donation, where he walked the length and breadth of India, inspiring landowners to give their land away to those who didn't have it. And the amount of land collected in that movement was larger than the size of Lebanon. Just think about that for a moment. And so this guy, most people haven't heard of him. The economists completely ignore what he had to offer, because it doesn't fit any economic theory of our time. And so if you look at the meta strategy, so Gandhi's organization was called Sarvodaya, which means upliftment of all. His head was around satyagraha, or insistence on truth. His heart was around, this organization's heart was around upliftment of all. And the habit was ahimsa, or non-violence. When Vinoba came around, the head changed because India had gained freedom, but he focused on voluntary giving, dan. So he had lots of, he had give your land, give your time, all kinds of movements around that. But the heart value, upliftment of all, remained the same. And he brought a very different energy. So Gandhi was solid in ahimsa, non-violence, and Vinoba kind of took it to a different level. He focused on love. In fact, the only book that Vinoba can be said to have authored is called Moved by Love. And so you can see kind of the organization took this direction. There's even a website now called movedbylove.org where you can see the ripple effects of what Vinoba did. But he was a follower. So now the point I'm making here is it's not just about leadership, it's about great followership and changing things around. But even that duality doesn't really fit well, because you can say, Vinoba, was he just a follower? Was he a leader? And perhaps he was a latter. So we have this macho lone hero idea of a leader, but perhaps what reality is closer to this, where you're standing on the shoulder of giants, and latter is a person who helps you bring your game up. And there's a nice quote from the Lao Tzu: from the Tao Te Ching, leaders are best known when leaders are best when people barely know they exist. When their work is done, their aim fulfilled, people say, we did it ourselves. It's a different paradigm of leadership, and Jim Collins talks about this as level 5 leadership. So basically, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Basically, ladders undertake a guardianship of the organization's meta strategy. And I just want to make a few concluding remarks now, which is that meta strategy redefines the purpose of a business. And I'd like to say this as the purpose of a business is to be a business of purpose. And the old business leaders used to understand this. I'm not saying anything new in this talk, by the way. So let's see So my slide is a little messed up here. Karen, can you read the Walt Disney quote for me?
Yes, the quote is, we don't make movies to make money. We make money to make movies.
And Henry Ford said, business must be run at a profit, else it will die. But when anyone tries to run a business solely for profit, then the business must die as well, for it no longer has a reason for existence. So basically, you are the self-declared trustee of your meta strategy for society, and if you drop the ball on it, society won't get to experience it. So where do we go from here? I don't really know, but perhaps knowing our meta strategy can help us detect misalignments between strategy and meta strategy, perhaps give us greater clarity for inspired work. And I also find it very interesting when we do these value mapping exercises, something's moving in me, like I can feel some shifts in my heart, and so does the other person. So it'll be wonderful to put people under the scanner when we're having these value conversations. Something's happening, something's shifting in us when we think about these things. So I'd like to end with an acknowledgement to to 3 very important people in this journey of mine. And one is Robert Hartman, who formulated this field called formal axiology, which is where these distinctions and values come from. And Professor Howard, without whom I couldn't have done any of these things. And for David, because he really supports this at SmartOrg and allows me to do these wacky things, even when we have no idea how this connects to our business. So I just want to give a big thank you to all of them. And end with this quote: don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And I'd like to stop there and see what reflections people have or questions. Seeing some great comments. So Karen, it's over to you and you can take this forward.
Okay, thank you. We'll also watch for questions. You have one question, unquote, that just says bravo. So count that as a thanks to Somik. I think all of you should have in your Q&A panel the kind of comments that came in under integration. And if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask, go ahead and type them in, and I can ask them of Somik. You're getting more compliments, Somik. Here's the question. Can you go back to the table that linked these to decision analysis? So I think the decision quality framework head and heart slide.
Yes, just a moment. Take this. Yeah.
Now we'll see if there's a follow-up to that question.
I'm seeing a story in here, sharing integration. Do you want to read that, Karen?
Sure. So there was a story that was shared in terms of integration from an oil and gas example, where headquarters wanted to build a contingent IT center that was hurricane hardened in a different city to be used in the event of a hurricane in the current IT city. After about a week of analysis with some senior people, the numbers were confusing. They weren't leading to a clear answer, I guess. This person who wrote the story said he was there alone one night with another senior person. That senior person was leaving, came by my space, and our storyteller said, just asked him what motivated your interest in evaluating this. And what he said was, I just can't have employee injuries on my conscience. And he wanted to provide a safe alternative for those who work in the event of threats. So while this was all posed as a savings for IT, it was really driven by this concern about safety.
It's my turn to say bravo.
Here's a question that I actually asked Somik about this as well from someone who said, what is the difference between intrinsic values and strategic values from kind of the Keeney school of thought?
Okay. So, just Karen prepared me for this. I have some thoughts on this. So here's a quote from Jonathan Barron in his paper. He says, values are the criteria that we use to evaluate outcomes. Fundamental values are those that express our most important concerns. So it's a very different definition of values, but which is fine. But what I mean by intrinsic values are states of being, not outcomes. So the fundamental difference between what we value and how we value. And I didn't share this in detail, but basically the three dimensions of value, they're not just definitions on what they are, but also how we relate with them. So when we are valuing something intrinsically, it becomes inseparable from who we are. Extrinsic or practical values are separable, so you can talk about it, and systemic is land of objectivity. You're furthest removed when you are in systemic land. And in multi-attribute utilities, what ends up happening is that the fundamental values very quickly get used to turn them into metrics and use them for trade-offs. And that's fine, but basically that's systemic land. And my use of intrinsic values is very different. I'm actually not taking it to analysis. I'm using it as for holding space and for ideation. So, and strategic fit, not for trade-offs. That's the fundamental difference. And the second thing that's very interesting to me is how do you get to these intrinsic values? So yes, we know that they're different at the end in itself, but how do you find them? And this idea of listening for silence is very powerful for me, or emotion, or things like that. I hope, does that answer, Karen?
Yes, thank you. There's another question from it says, we are trying to integrate values with visions as we pull the disconnect. We want to address it to create an innovative work environment. Do you have any comments on routes to pursue?
Yeah, so it's always hard to figure out what's the best way forward, but I had somebody ask me if they wanted to do this in their organization, and what I found worked for them was having people interview each other, so people you consider as a friend who will hold space for you and not judge. It's very important to not be judgmental when you're listening. And at the same time, we'll have these distinctions in their mind so that they can keep probing. So, almost, I can't tell you how many times I've asked people about their values, and they'll always start with something universal, which, and if you really listen for this, you'll find that it doesn't make them emotional. So it's like somebody says, well, I care about treating people well, I care about compassion, I care about respect, integrity, and so on. And I'm like, wait a second. You care about this, and yet you're able to talk about this. How could that be? That means you don't care enough about it. If you really care, if you're really letting yourself go, you will tremble. You will have a hard time not breaking down before you talk about this. That's the feeling I'm trying to get to. And the question is, how do you create a space where people feel safe to let themselves explore this part of themselves? And what can you do to make that space welcoming, safe, and powerful?
Thanks, Somik. I've got my eye on the clock. I think we are told to end promptly on time. I see that some people are already dropping off. So let me just thank Somik again from the Society. We really appreciate the time and effort you put into this webinar, and hand it back over to Hilda for the wrap-up.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. And we hope you found this webinar informational. Our webinars are open to anyone without charge. They are free because of the support of those who paid forward to enable you to attend. To continue the chain of giving and to ensure we can continue this open access webinar series, we invite you to pay it forward and support our next webinar. You may do so by visiting our website at www.decisionprofessionals.com. I want to remind you that you can download a copy of today's presentation by clicking on the handout icon in the upper right of the menu bar, selecting the file, and clicking download. Alternatively, you may select from the bottom right menu, print to PDF. Thank you again for being with us today, and you may now disconnect.